Ryan could feel his pulse quicken as Vanessa leaned in closer, her knee brushing against his again, her lips just inches from his ear. Everything about her was magnetic, and he knew exactly what she was doing, playing with him, pushing him to see how far he'd go. The worst part? He liked it. Vanessa's hand rested casually on his leg, the touch light but intentional. Her fingers traced the fabric of his jeans, and Ryan's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't felt this kind of pull in months, not since things with Claire had gone south. But Vanessa was different. She wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't trying to have a conversation about feelings or the future. This was raw, simple. She wanted him, and she wasn't shy about it. "So," Vanessa said softly, her voice dripping with suggestion, "you never answered my question?" Ryan blinked, his mind trying to catch up. "What question?" "Why you're here," Vanessa said, her lips brushing the side of his neck. "Why you moved in? Was it really just to get away from the ex?" Ryan felt a twinge of frustration, but it wasn't enough to pull him out of the moment. "Yeah, something like that." "She must have messed you up pretty bad if you're still thinking about her," Vanessa teased, her fingers now trailing up his thigh, dangerously close to where his body was starting to respond in ways he wasn't sure he could hide. "It's not that," Ryan muttered, his voice a little too tight. "I'm just trying to start over." Vanessa smiled, her breath hot against his skin. "Starting over is good," she whispered. "Sometimes all you need is a clean slate." Her hand slid higher, and Ryan's mind went blank. He wanted to push her away, to stop this before it got out of hand, but every fiber of his body was screaming for him to keep going, to give in to the temptation that had been building since the moment she'd knocked on his door. "You're trouble, you know that?" Ryan said, his voice low as he turned to face her, his eyes locking with hers. Vanessa's smile widened. "I know." Before he could talk himself out of it, Ryan's hand slid to the back of her neck, pulling her closer. Their lips met, the kiss intense, hungry, like neither of them could get enough. Vanessa responded immediately, her body pressing against his, her hands gripping his shirt as she kissed him back with a kind of urgency that sent a jolt of heat through his veins. It was fast, messy, their mouths moving against each other as if they were both trying to take control. Ryan's hands roamed over her body, feeling the heat of her skin through the thin fabric of her tank top, and his mind screamed at him to stop, to think. But he didn't care. Not now. Not with her. Vanessa's fingers tugged at his shirt, pulling it over his head in one smooth motion before she straddled him, her knees on either side of his legs, her body pressed flush against his. She was bold, confident, taking what she wanted, and Ryan found himself drawn to her even more because of it. There was no hesitation, no second guessing, just pure, unfiltered desire. "Tell me you want this," Vanessa whispered against his lips, her breath hot, her voice a little shaky but laced with that same confidence. Ryan didn't hesitate. "I do." "Good," she breathed, kissing him again, deeper this time, her hips shifting against his, driving him crazy with the friction. His hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer, his mind swimming with the realization that this was happening, that he was giving in to something he knew was a bad idea. But in the heat of the moment, with Vanessa's body pressed against his, the taste of her lips still on his tongue, Ryan couldn't bring himself to care. The night unfolded in a blur of tangled limbs and breathless kisses, every touch pushing them further toward the edge. It wasn't slow. It wasn't careful. It was fast, urgent, like they both knew they were crossing a line but couldn't stop themselves. Vanessa was relentless, pulling him deeper into her game, her body moving against his in a way that left him dizzy, his mind barely able to keep up. Somewhere in the back of his head, Ryan knew this was trouble. She lived next door, for God's sake. If things went sideways, he wouldn't be able to avoid her, wouldn't be able to escape the fallout. But right now, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the heat between them, the way Vanessa made him feel like he was in control, even though he knew she was the one calling the shots. They stumbled toward the bedroom, clothes coming off in a trail behind them. Vanessa pushed him onto the bed, her eyes dark and full of that same mischievous glint that had drawn him in from the start. "You're going to remember this," she whispered, climbing on top of him, her hands pressing against his chest as she leaned in, her lips brushing his ear. "I promise." Ryan's breath hitched, his heart pounding in his chest as Vanessa kissed him again, her hips grinding against his in a way that made him forget everything else. The only thing that existed in that moment was her body, her touch, her heat. And damn, did it feel good? The rest of the night was a blur, an electric mix of pleasure and frustration, lust and anger, all tangled together in a way that left Ryan's mind spinning. Vanessa was intense, relentless, like she was trying to push him past his limits, trying to see how far she could take him. And the more she pushed, the more Ryan gave in, losing himself in the game she was playing. Hours later, when they finally collapsed onto the bed, both of them breathless, their bodies slick with sweat, Ryan stared up at the ceiling, his mind still racing. Vanessa was next to him, her chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths, her hand resting on his stomach. It should have felt satisfying. He should have felt victorious, like he'd won something. But instead, all he felt was confusion. Vanessa wasn't the kind of woman who did anything without a reason. She was playing a game, and Ryan knew it. The question was, what was her endgame? What did she want from him? And was he just a pawn in whatever twisted thing she was working toward? He didn't know, and right now, lying next to her, he wasn't sure he wanted to. The next morning, Ryan woke up to an empty bed. Vanessa was gone, her side of the bed cold, her presence nothing more than a lingering scent on the pillow. He sat up, running a hand through his hair as the events of the night before replayed in his head. The kiss, the touch, the way she'd taken control. It was all too fresh, too raw. He glanced around the room, noticing a small note left on the nightstand. He picked it up, recognizing Vanessa's handwriting immediately. "Thanks for the fun. See you around, neighbor." Ryan stared at the note for a long moment, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. She was playing him. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she'd left him hanging, wanting more. And now, he had no idea what to do next. Shit. He was hooked. Ryan stared at the note for what felt like forever, his mind running through 1,000 different thoughts, none of them making much sense. Vanessa had been gone before he'd even woken up, leaving behind nothing but her scent and that smug little message. "See you around, neighbor." Like what had happened between them was nothing more than a casual hookup, just another fun night for her to file away and forget. What the hell did I get myself into? Ryan thought, tossing the note onto the bed. He couldn't shake the feeling that Vanessa was playing a different kind of game, one he wasn't used to. She had this way of getting under his skin, making him want her more even after he'd had her. It was infuriating, and yet a part of him couldn't deny how much he craved more. Last night had been intense, sure, but there was something about Vanessa that kept pulling him in, no matter how much his brain screamed at him to back off. Ryan dragged himself out of bed, heading to the kitchen for some coffee. He needed something to clear his head, something to keep him grounded. His body ached from the night before, but it wasn't just physical. His thoughts were tangled, emotions knotted up with desire and frustration. She lives right next door, he reminded himself. This is a bad idea. But as the coffee brewed, his mind kept wandering back to her voice, her touch, the way she'd looked at him like she knew exactly what he was thinking. It was like Vanessa had figured out his every weakness, and she was using them against him. The weekend passed uneventfully, but Ryan couldn't get Vanessa out of his head. He kept thinking about the way she'd just left, like she didn't care about what happened next. Part of him knew she didn't. She was probably used to this, hooking up with whoever caught her eye, then moving on without a second thought. But Ryan wasn't that kind of guy. He wasn't looking for a one-night thing, especially not with someone who lived right next door. Yet here he was, unable to stop himself from wanting her again. On Sunday night, he found himself standing by his front door, debating whether or not to knock on hers. He told himself he just wanted to talk, to clear the air. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He wanted more. He wanted her. And that realization hit him like a punch to the gut. You're already in too deep, he thought, frustrated with himself. Just as he was about to turn away from the door, there was a knock. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. He knew who it was before he even opened it. Vanessa stood there, leaning against the doorframe with that same casual confidence she always carried. Her smile was soft, playful, like she knew exactly what he'd been thinking about all weekend. "Hey neighbor," she said, her voice low and teasing. "Miss me?" Ryan crossed his arms, trying to keep his cool. "You left pretty early." Vanessa shrugged, her eyes gleaming with amusement. "I figured I'd give you some space. Didn't want you thinking I was the clingy type." Ryan couldn't help but smirk, despite himself. "And what type are you?" Vanessa stepped closer, her fingers lightly brushing his arm. "The fun type." There it was again, that magnetic pull. Ryan could feel himself being drawn into her orbit, unable to resist. She was trouble, and he knew it. But trouble had never looked so tempting. "You want to come in?" Ryan asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Vanessa raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a smile. "I was hoping you'd ask." They ended up on the couch again, a glass of wine in each of their hands, but the tension between them was palpable. It was like they were both waiting for the other to make the first move, but Ryan didn't want to play her game this time. He wasn't just going to let her control the narrative. He had questions she probably wasn't going to answer, but that didn't mean he wouldn't try. "So, is this what you do?" Ryan asked, keeping his tone casual. "Find the new guy in the building and see how long it takes to get him into bed?" Vanessa smiled, sipping her wine as if his question didn't bother her in the slightest. "Not usually, but you seem like you could use the distraction." Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't even know me?" "I know enough," she said, her eyes flicking to his. "You're running from something. A breakup, maybe. You're trying to start fresh, but you don't really know how. You're stuck in your head, overthinking everything. So, yeah, I figured I could help take your mind off things." Her words hit a little too close to home, and Ryan couldn't help but feel a flicker of frustration. She made it sound so simple, like she had him all figured out. But there was something about her confidence that both intrigued and irritated him. "So what?" Ryan asked, leaning forward. "I'm just a distraction for you too?" Vanessa's smile softened, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Maybe, but you're the one who let me in." Ryan's chest tightened at her words, the truth of them sinking in. She wasn't wrong. He had let her in, knowing full well that she was trouble, knowing that this could complicate everything. But that didn't change the fact that she'd come to him first, that she'd been the one pushing things forward. He took a deep breath, his hand gripping his glass a little too tightly. "And what happens now?" Vanessa's smile widened, that playful glint returning to her eyes. "I guess that depends on you." Ryan leaned back, taking a long sip of his wine. He could feel the tension between them thickening, the air practically buzzing with it. Part of him wanted to push her away, to end this before it got too complicated. But another part, the part that was already hooked, wanted to see where this would go. Later that night, after Vanessa had left again, Ryan sat on the edge of his bed, his thoughts spinning. He didn't know what he was doing anymore. This wasn't like him. He wasn't the kind of guy who got caught up in games like this, who let himself get pulled into something he knew was a bad idea. But Vanessa was different. She wasn't just a woman looking for a fling. She was playing with him, testing him, and it was driving him crazy. As he lay back on his bed, staring up at the ceiling, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head. Vanessa wasn't just a distraction. She was something more dangerous. And now, he was stuck in her web, unsure of how to get out. But the worst part? He wasn't sure he wanted to. The next few days felt like a blur. Ryan found himself thinking about Vanessa constantly, during work, at the gym, even when he was trying to sleep. She had gotten under his skin in a way no one had before. The more he thought about her, the more he realized that this wasn't just a casual fling. It felt like a game, sure, but it was a game he was slowly losing control of. He tried to distract himself, throwing himself into work and spending extra hours at the office just to avoid running into her. But the nights were the hardest. Every time he came home, every time he heard the faint sounds of music or laughter coming from her apartment, the same tension stirred inside him. It was like an itch he couldn't scratch. And Vanessa knew it. She didn't reach out. She didn't knock on his door, But every time they crossed paths in the hallway, she gave him that same sly smile, her eyes flicking over him like she was daring him to make the next move. She had him hooked, and she knew it. Damn her, Ryan thought, lying awake one night, staring up at the ceiling. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was playing him, testing him, seeing how far she could push before he snapped. But instead of pulling away, he kept getting drawn deeper into her web. It was late Friday night when everything came to a head. Ryan had spent the evening trying to distract himself with drinks and video games, but nothing seemed to work. His thoughts kept drifting back to Vanessa, what she was doing, who she was with, whether or not she was thinking about him. It was driving him insane, and then, as if on cue, his phone buzzed. Vanessa. What are you up to? Ryan stared at the message, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he should ignore it. He knew this was exactly what she wanted, to reel him back in, to keep him wrapped around her finger. But even as he thought that, his fingers were already typing a response. Ryan. Just hanging out? You? Her reply came almost immediately. Vanessa. Come over. 2 words. Simple. Director. But they hit Ryan like a punch to the gut. He knew what this was. He knew what would happen if he went over there. But the pull was too strong. The curiosity, the tension, the raw desire, it was all too much. Without thinking, he grabbed his keys and headed for the door. Vanessa's apartment was only a few steps away, but the walk felt longer than it should have. Ryan's mind raced with a mix of anticipation and doubt. Part of him wanted to turn around, to avoid whatever mess this would turn into. But the other part, the part that had been craving this, pushed him forward. When he knocked on her door, it swung open almost immediately. Vanessa stood there, wearing nothing but a loose, oversized t-shirt that barely covered the tops of her thighs. Her hair was messy, her eyes dark and inviting. You came, she said, her voice soft but filled with satisfaction. Yeah, Ryan muttered, stepping inside. I guess I did. The door clicked shut behind him, and the air in the room shifted. Vanessa moved closer, her body brushing against his as she leaned in, her lips grazing his ear. You've been thinking about me, haven't you? Ryan's jaw clenched. She knew exactly what she was doing, and it pissed him off just as much as it turned him on. He didn't want to admit that she had been on his mind constantly, that she had been driving him crazy with her little games. But standing there, with her body pressed against his, it was impossible to deny. Yeah, he said, his voice low and rough. I have. Vanessa smiled, her fingers trailing down his arm. Good. The next few minutes were a blur of heat and tension. Vanessa kissed him hard, her body pressed against his like she couldn't get close enough. Her hands roamed over him, pulling at his clothes, her movements impatient, hungry. But this time, something was different. Ryan wasn't just a passive player in her game. He grabbed her wrists, pinning them against the wall as he kissed her back, his body pressed against hers with a kind of force that made her gasp. If Vanessa wanted to play, fine, but he wasn't going to let her call all the shots. You think you're in control here? Ryan growled, his lips brushing her neck. Vanessa let out a breathless laugh, her body arching against him. I'm always in control. Ryan tightened his grip on her wrists, his heart racing. Not tonight. The rest of the night was fast, intense, and filled with a kind of reckless abandon that left Ryan's head spinning. Vanessa was a force of nature, pushing him further than he'd ever been. But for once, he felt like he was pushing back just as hard. By the time they collapsed onto the bed, both of them breathless and spent, Ryan's mind was a blur. He didn't know what had just happened, didn't know what this meant. But in that moment, lying next to Vanessa, her body warm and soft against his, he didn't care. All he knew was that he had never felt like this before, this raw, untamed energy that surged between them. But as the adrenaline began to wear off, reality started to creep back in. What the hell was he doing? He barely knew her. And yet, he was getting sucked deeper into whatever this was, this game, this dangerous dance they were doing. Vanessa lay next to him, her breathing steady, her eyes half closed. She looked content, satisfied, like she had gotten exactly what she wanted. But Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing right into her hands. The next morning, Ryan woke up alone again. Vanessa had slipped out of bed without a word, leaving him tangled in the sheets, his thoughts racing. This was becoming a pattern, one that was starting to bother him. Vanessa would pull him in, leave him wanting more, and then disappear without a trace. It was like she was toying with him, seeing how far she could push before he snapped. And the worst part? He was letting her. Ryan sat up, running a hand through his hair, frustration gnawing at him. He wasn't the type to get played like this. He wasn't the type to fall for someone who was clearly just using him for her own amusement. But Vanessa had a way of getting under his skin, and no matter how much he tried to fight it, he couldn't seem to shake her hold on him. I need to figure out what the hell is going on, he thought, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. This is getting out of control. Later that day, Ryan found himself standing in front of Vanessa's door, debating whether or not to knock. He needed answers. He needed to know what this was, if it was just a fling, or if she was playing some twisted game with him. But before he could raise his hand to knock, the door swung open. Vanessa stood there, her expression unreadable, her eyes locking with his. She didn't look surprised to see him. In fact, she almost looked like she had been expecting him. "Hey," Ryan said, his voice rough. "Hey," Vanessa replied, leaning against the door frame. "What's up?" Ryan hesitated, unsure of how to start. "We need to talk." Vanessa raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into that familiar, teasing smile. "About what?" "You know about what," Ryan said, stepping closer. "What is this, Vanessa? What are we doing?" Her smile softened, her eyes flicking over him like she was assessing him. "You tell me." Ryan clenched his jaw, frustration boiling to the surface. "I'm serious. You can't keep doing this, pulling me in and then disappearing. What do you want from me?" Vanessa tilted her head, her smile fading slightly. For the first time, Ryan saw something in her eyes that wasn't amusement or teasing. It was something else, something deeper. "I don't know," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "I'm still figuring that out." Ryan's chest tightened at her words. She wasn't playing a game, at least not in the way he had thought. She was just as lost as he was, just as unsure. And that realization hit him harder than he expected. "Then stop playing with me," Ryan said, his voice low but firm. "If you don't know what you want, then don't drag me into it." Vanessa didn't respond right away. She just stood there, her eyes locked on his, the tension between them thicker than ever. And for the first time since they'd met, Ryan saw a flicker of vulnerability in her. "Okay," she whispered, stepping aside to let him in. "Let's figure it out together." Ryan didn't move to this part of town for excitement. After his breakup with Claire, he was looking for quiet, something to take his mind off the shitstorm of emotions he'd been dealing with for the past few months. His new apartment wasn't anything special. One bedroom, tiny kitchen, decent enough view of the city. It was enough. He wasn't expecting much from the neighborhood either. Just another group of strangers he'd ignore while he went about his day. That was until Vanessa showed up at his door. It was his second night in the new place. Ryan had been unpacking boxes, trying to make sense of the mess he'd brought with him, when there was a knock. He opened the door, expecting the delivery guy with the food he'd ordered. Instead, there she was. Vanessa. She was the kind of woman you couldn't look away from. Tall, long legs, caramel skin, and a smile that could knock the wind out of you. Her dark hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, and her eyes sparkled with the kind of mischief that made Ryan immediately uncomfortable. "Hey," she said, leaning against the doorframe like she belonged there. "You must be the new guy." "Yeah," Ryan managed, his voice a little too tight. "Ryan." "Vanessa," she said, her lips curling into a smile that felt just a little too knowing. "I'm right next door. Figured I'd come by and welcome you to the building." Ryan nodded, trying not to stare too long at her legs or the curve of her hips. He hadn't been with anyone since the breakup, hadn't even thought about it. But Vanessa was different. She wasn't just attractive. She was the kind of woman who knew she was attractive and didn't mind using it. "Thanks," he said, stepping back awkwardly. "You want to come in?" She grinned, a glint of amusement in her eyes. Sure, let's see what you've done with the place. Vanessa stepped inside, glancing around at the half-unpacked boxes and the bare walls. Ryan could feel her eyes on him, assessing, judging, but in a way that made his pulse quicken. He couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking. Nice, she said, walking toward the window. You've got a decent view. Yeah, Ryan replied, following her. It's not bad. Vanessa turned to face him, leaning against the windowsill. So, Ryan, what brings you here? Ryan shrugged, trying to keep his voice casual. Needed a change? Breakup. You know how it goes. She nodded, her smile softening. Ah, I see. Fresh start, huh? Something like that. Vanessa's gaze lingered on him for a moment, and Ryan felt the tension in the room shift. There was something about the way she looked at him, like she was sizing him up, figuring out how far she could push. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, his thoughts drifting to places they shouldn't. He barely knew her, but the pull was undeniable. You'll like it here, Vanessa said, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone. The building's nice, neighbors are friendly. Maybe too friendly sometimes, Ryan raised an eyebrow. Too friendly, Vanessa's smile widened. You'll see. After a few minutes of small talk, Vanessa made her exit, leaving behind the scent of her perfume and the impression that she wasn't done with him yet. Ryan shut the door and leaned against it, letting out a long breath. What the hell was that? He wasn't naive. He knew when someone was flirting with him, and Vanessa had practically been flashing a neon sign that said, "Come and get it." But after the mess with Claire, the last thing Ryan wanted was to get involved with another woman, especially one who lived right next door. Still, as he unpacked the rest of his boxes that night, he couldn't shake the image of Vanessa leaning against his window, her eyes locking with his like she could see right through him. Stay focused, Ryan told himself. She's trouble. You don't need that right now. But his mind had other ideas. The next few days were uneventful. Ryan settled into his new routine, work, gym, unpacking the rest of his stuff. He'd see Vanessa in the hall sometimes, catching glimpses of her as she came and went, always with that same smile, always with that same playful glint in her eyes. She never said much, just a casual, "Hey neighbor," or "How's the new place?" But every time Ryan could feel her watching him, like she was waiting for something. And the worst part? He was starting to want it too. It was Friday night when things took a turn. Ryan had been planning a quiet night in, grab some takeout, watch a movie, maybe drink a beer or two. But as he settled onto the couch, there was a knock at the door. Vanessa. Ryan opened the door, and there she was, dressed in a casual tank top and shorts that left very little to the imagination. Her hair was up in a messy bun, and she had a bottle of wine in one hand, 2 glasses in the other. "I thought you could use some company," she said, that same smile playing on her lips. Ryan hesitated for a moment, his mind screaming at him to shut the door, to stop whatever this was before it started. But his body? His body had other ideas. "Sure," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "Why not?" Vanessa poured the wine and they sat on the couch talking about everything and nothing. She was easy to talk to, funny in a dry, sarcastic way that Ryan appreciated. But there was always that underlying tension, an electric current that hummed between them, pulling them closer even as they pretended to keep things casual. At one point, Vanessa leaned in, her knee brushing against his. "You know," she said, her voice low, "I've seen a lot of people move in and out of this building, but I have a feeling you're gonna stick around." Ryan chuckled, trying to ignore the way his pulse quickened at her touch. "Yeah? Why's that?" Vanessa's smile was slow, deliberate. "Because I think you're different. And I like that." There it was again, that look, that challenge. She was daring him to make a move, daring him to give in. Ryan knew this was a bad idea. He knew getting involved with his neighbor, this neighbor, was asking for trouble. But as Vanessa leaned in, her breath warm against his skin, all of his good intentions started to slip away.